All right, here we go. Chapter 13, Land of Stories. The Enchantress returns. Chapter 13, Jars of Souls. Deep in the heart of the dwarf forest, where the trees and shrubbery grew the thickest, was a small hut unseen by all who passed it. A witch named Hagatha had lived in the hut many years ago and strategically planted a wall of thorn bushes around her home, making it virtually impossible to find. And although the witch was long dead, the hut had more residents now than ever before. The enchantress had turned the hut into her new home following the restoration of her powers. It still looked the same on the outside, with only two windows and a hay roof, and but it had been charmed to become a spacious manor the moment someone walked through the door. It had large rooms with high ceilings and black stone walls. A wide fireplace was made of amethyst stones, within which a fire of purple flames burned a collection of skulls like firewood. The furniture was made of exotic porcupine and salamander animal skins. A chandelier made of various species' teeth hung from the ceiling but gave no light. It was usually a quiet place, but tonight the piercing cries of a child echoed through its halls. "Please be quiet, little princess," said Rumpelstiltskin. Princess Hope was more than half his size, but he still rocked the 1-year-old back and forth, trying to soothe her. "Mama!" the princess cried. "Mama!" "You can't have your mama, I'm afraid," Rumpelstiltskin told the child, and she bawled harder than before. "She's been crying for more than a day," said Charlotte Bailey from the back of the room. "Would you please just give her to me?" The twins' mother was imprisoned in a large bird cage that swung a few feet above the ground. "What makes you think you can get her to stop crying?" Rumpelstiltskin asked. He was exhausted from having to care for the child the last day. "I'm a nurse. It's what I do." Charlotte was still dressed in her nursing scrubs. She had just finished a shift at the children's hospital when a mysterious blanket of light wrapped around her and transported her into the fairy tale world. It didn't take long for Charlotte to realize that the enchantress who had summoned her there was after her daughter, and so for Alex's protection, Charlotte had pretended to be her daughter. It didn't appear that Princess Hope would calm down any time soon. Against his better judgment, Rumpelstiltskin handed the young princess to Charlotte through the bars of the cage. He didn't care how angry Esmea would be to find the child with the other prisoner. He just wanted the crying to stop. Rumpelstiltskin had never been good with kids. There, baby girl," Charlotte said and stroked Hope's auburn curls. "It's going to be okay. It's all going to be okay." Slowly but surely, Princess Hope calmed down in Charlotte's maternal embrace, sleeping for the first time since she had been taken. All the young princess needed was a mother's touch. Rumpelstiltskin was so relieved to have silence. He could have slept for 3 days if he were allowed. Charlotte studied the little man. Nothing about him was malicious like his master. He seemed like such a gentle and kind man. "So you're Rumpelstiltskin?" she asked. "Yes," he said with a remorseful shrug, ashamed of the reputation that came with his name. "Did you really spin hay into gold for the maiden, like the story says?" "That I did," Rumpelstiltskin admitted. "And did you really try to take her firstborn child away from her?" Charlotte said, finding it hard to believe. Rumpelstiltskin let out a heavy sigh. "That's what Esmea wanted me to do," he said, "but I couldn't go through with it. I told the maiden, well, she was a queen by that point, and I would dismiss her end of our bargain if she could guess my name." "And she did, if I recall," Charlotte said. It had been a while since she'd heard the story. "I made sure she did," Rumpelstiltskin confessed. "I caught one of her soldiers following me. I danced around a fire, proclaiming my name to the whole forest as loud as I could." "So you intentionally made it easy for her?" "That was very kind of you." A tiny smile grew on Rumpelstiltskin's face, but it quickly faded. "I thought so too. Unfortunately, no one will ever know that part of the story." "People are quick to judge," Charlotte asked, "and I'm no exception. I never wondered why you did all those things. My mind was just made up. You were just a villain," he said, unfazed. It was what he had been known as the majority of his life. Yes, a villain. Rumpelstiltskin was growing very comfortable talking to Charlotte. Too comfortable. Had he not been so tired, he might have kept his guard up, but he couldn't deny there was something trustworthy about Charlotte. They were both good people stuck in a bad situation. "How did someone like you get mixed up with someone like her?" Charlotte asked, shaking her head. "Because I had the misfortune of being born a dreamer," he said sadly. "A dwarf is born with one option: become a miner. A life spent in dark tunnels under the ground was never what I wanted for myself. I always loved being outside with the plants and animals. I used to daydream about being a shepherd or a farmer. My brothers used to scold me day and night for it. They said being a miner was an honor, and I was lucky. Then one day Esmea came to me with an offer to be her apprentice. Rumpelstiltskin rubbed his eyes and took his seat on the porcupine skin chair, too fatigued to mind the needles poking him. It's funny, he said. I didn't think twice about saying yes, but I've regretted it every day of my life. Charlotte couldn't help but feel sorry for him. She realized there were 3 prisoners under this roof. Anyone would have said yes if they were in your shoes, she said. Back then, perhaps, Rumpelstiltskin agreed, but now no one would ever admit to it. A strong breeze blew through the room. Why is the child with her? Said a booming voice that made Charlotte and Rumpelstiltskin jump. Esmea had suddenly appeared. The enchantress seemed tired. Her posture wasn't quite as straight, and her hair didn't flow as freely as it had before. Esmea had been planning this night for a long time, and it hadn't ended the way she wanted. Rumpelstiltskin immediately hopped out of the chair. Princess Hope wouldn't stop crying, he said, and I wanted you to have a silent home to return to. Esmea scowled at Charlotte, and she held on to the princess even tighter. The enchantress moved toward the cage and peered in at them through the bars like a preying hawk. You're awfully good with children, aren't you? Esmea said suspiciously. I told you I'm a nurse. It's my job. I take care of sick children at the hospital. Esmea raised an eyebrow. Interesting, she said. I never expected the fairy godmother's granddaughter to be so old. Well, not all of us have magic holding us up, Charlotte retorted. You've got spirit, I'll give you that, Esmea said. Perhaps this will humble you. Esmea placed the glass jar she'd been carrying on a small table close to Charlotte's cage. Charlotte was horrified to see a miniature ghostly version of the fairy godmother trapped inside. That's my grandmother, Charlotte said, almost forgetting she was still pretending to be her own daughter. What have you done to her? A smile appeared on Esmea's face, matching the satisfaction in her eyes. I captured her soul, she said. The thought almost made Charlotte sick. She had had no idea such a thing was possible, even in the fairy tale world. What do you want with her soul? That's a bit of a hobby of mine, actually, Esmea said, as she walked to the fireplace. Displayed proudly on the mantel were 5 other turquoise jars, each containing a ghostly substance. You're a soul collector? Charlotte asked. Is it to make up for being soulless? What a clever play on words, Esmea said mockingly. You know the phrase forgive and forget? Well, I always disagreed with it. I found it impossible, actually. People would do me wrong, and then they'd forget about me, as if their actions didn't matter, because I didn't matter. How was I supposed to forgive people like that? So you imprisoned their souls instead of forgiving? Precisely, Esmea said. I found taking away their life force to be much more appealing than simply forgiving. To forgive would be to allow them to continue living their lives free of consequence, but by taking their souls and preventing them from all future happiness, I could heal and find peace. Charlotte couldn't believe what she was hearing. Do you honestly expect anyone to sympathize with that? Charlotte asked. Esmea stared into the fire at the burning skulls, almost in a trance. I don't want the world to understand. I want it to grovel, she said. The confession made Charlotte's heart heavier. She wondered if she'd ever escape the clutches of a person who thought like this. But thinking about her children, Bob, and the life she had stolen gave Charlotte the strength to survive the enchantress's imprisonment. I find it hard to believe that the fairy godmother who's known for her generosity would harm you in any way, Charlotte said. Sometimes help can be just as destructive as harm, Esmea said, but I can imagine someone who helps for a profession couldn't comprehend that. Enlighten me, Charlotte challenged. The enchantress raised her eyebrows. The fairy godmother found me in the other world when I was just a girl. I was alone, orphaned, and starving. She brought me here to live with the fairies in the fairy kingdom. They gave me a home, taught me to use magic in a productive manner, and in time trained me to become one of the greatest fairies in the kingdom. Charlotte shook her head as though she'd misunderstood. That doesn't sound like something to begrudge, she said. Success can scar you as much as failure, Esmea continued. The more I surpassed the other fairies with my talents, the more they resented me. Fairies are incredibly jealous creatures, although no one ever talks about it, because it would tamper their image. When the fairy godmother declared me her protege, all the other fairies distanced themselves from me. I had never asked for the attention, but they targeted their frustrations on me as if I had done something to personally offend them. Every spell I cast and every enchantment I performed was subject to an unjustified amount of criticism. Even though I was accomplishing incredible things left and right, my achievements were being ignored because of the special treatment I received. I became ashamed of my gifts, and mediocrity became my new goal, wanting to be in the same league as the others. Lowering my standard only aggravated them more, and by the time I reached adolescence, I was alone and starving again, but this time for affection. The enchantress gestured to the jars displayed on her mantle. Which brings us to these, she said. Now, this section of the story is very close to my heart, you see, because inside the jars on my mantle are the souls of 5 men who unwisely broke it. 1 man who never loved me, 1 man who couldn't love me, 1 man who loved me too much, 1 man who loved me in secret, and one man who didn't love me enough. Esmea picked up the jars farthest to the left and looked inside it. A figure of a young man wearing an apron appeared in the ghostly substance inside. The baker was my first love, the enchantress said. He lived in a small village in the charming kingdom and worked in his family's bakery. He was the first person besides the fairy godmother to ever ask me if I was having a good day. I was so young and vulnerable, all it took was a shared smile to make me fall madly in love with him. We became close, and I confessed my deepest secrets to him. I was positive our love would last forever. Unfortunately for me, I learned his intentions were anything but genuine. I had been the subject of a practical joke. The baker had pretended to have feelings for me, only to report back to the other village youth that I had confessed to him. He had been playing a game with my heart the whole time. I went back to the fairy kingdom in tears. I was hoping for some kind of sympathy from them, some sort of compassion, but instead they laughed at me. They were happy to see something topple me from the pedestal I had never asked to be placed on. You see, I had broken an unwritten rule. Apparently, a person of privilege is never allowed to complain about anything. With no one to confide in and no shoulder to cry on, I ran into the forest and collapsed onto the roots of a tree. I lay there for hours and cried my heart out into its bark. That tree was the only thing that ever comforted me from the pain, and I visited that tree quite a bit over the years. Over time, I tried forgiving the baker, but it only angered me more. I returned to his bakery and demanded an apology. He refused, saying the whole thing had been a childish prank. So I cast a spell on the gingerbread man he was baking. It jumped up from the tray and ran away from him. It became quite the ordeal. The entire village chased after it with no success. The baker and his family became the laughingstock of the village, and they lost their bakery, but it made me feel so much better. That's when I learned that taking the high road would never give the same satisfaction as getting even. The enchantress set aside the baker's jar and moved on to the next one. A man holding a hammer with a chain draped over his shoulder appeared in the jar. The locksmith was a troubled man, Esmea said, and shook her head. A testament to his profession, he liked keeping his properties locked down, and I was no exception. I fell for him, mostly out of convenience, needing something to repair my heart from the damage left by the baker. He was such a quiet man, he barely said a word. He never looked me in the eye, and when he touched me, it was rarely out of affection. He definitely left his mark on me. Several, actually. And, like a fool, I stayed, thinking it might be the only type of love I would ever receive. When I finally told him I was leaving, he didn't even blink. He had so many demons already, I didn't feel the need to cause him more distress when we parted. I felt more anger toward myself than I did toward him for letting him harm me. I kept him as a reminder to never let myself sink to such pitiful depths again. Charlotte and Rumpelstiltskin looked sideways at each other. They couldn't believe the enchantress was telling them so much, but Esmea had completely lost herself in a stroll through the most painful memories of her past. The trip down memory lane wasn't entirely for them, however. Telling her captives the stories of her former loves appeared to gradually rejuvenate her from her long night. She stood taller, and her hair flowed more vigorously above her. The purple flames in her fireplace grew the more she reminisced. It was undeniable. The enchantress was fueled by the pain of her past. Esmea picked up the third jar. A man playing a pipe appeared in the cloudy substance. The musician was someone I thought I had been waiting for, Esmea confessed. I was so taken by his charm. He constantly serrated me with songs and sonnets. He was so eager to confess our love to the world, too eager. I soon realized that it wasn't me he was in love with, it was the idea of me. He wanted the world to know he was connected to the future fairy godmother, not Esmea. He was using me like a ladder. However, I stayed with him despite knowing his true intentions, dreading the thought of being alone. I showered him with gifts, in particular the infamous pipe he used to magically clear a town of rats. I had enchanted the pipe myself, and had hoped it would equalize our status. I thought if I gave him something that made him feel as important as me, he would learn to love me for me and not my title. Sadly, the only thing that grew following his victory was his ego, and it led him to infidelity and easily as he had led the rats to the river. I transformed his new girlfriend into an instrument so he could forever play her in the same way he had played me. The enchantress picked up the fourth jar on the mantel. She stared inside at the soul of a man dressed from head to toe in armor. The soldier was a very guarded man, Esmea said. He kept our relationship a total secret. It was refreshing to be with someone so private after the musician. Later I discovered his discretion was not to protect me, but to protect himself. The soldier was ashamed of our relationship. He thought if word broke that he was courting a fairy, it would damage his career, and he would never be promoted to a general. I cast a spell on him that flattened his feet and stiffened his joints. He spent the rest of his days guarding the entrance to a kitchen and never received any promotion at all. The enchantress moved on to the final jar on the mantel. A handsome young man wearing robes and a crown appeared inside it. Esmea looked at him differently than she had all the others. It was clearly the hardest memory to relive. The king hurt me more than anyone. Unlike all the others, the king treated me with compassion. All the rest failed to. He was my best friend and the only person I felt loved me back. Perhaps that common kinship is what made me fall for him more than the others, and is why it still hurts to this day. However, he never loved me as much as I loved him. Friendship was the only thing he wanted. I visited him every day hoping he would change his mind. One day, he caught me trying to give him a love potion. I'd never seen him so angry. He shouted for the entire castle to hear that he would never love me the same way I loved him, even with all the love potions in the world. I lost my temper, and I cursed the king to live as a hideous beast, turning him into the monster I thought he was. Eventually found a girl to love him despite his animalistic features, and my curse was broken. The story of Beauty and the Beast has exaggerated over time, but the king never told a soul I was the one who cursed him. He was still a friend after everything I had done to him. The king's rejection was the final break my heart could take. I thought if the king was incapable of loving me, no one could. The fairy godmother says I changed over that period of time, and she's right. I represented happily ever after, but couldn't find a happily ever after for myself. Everywhere I went, I was expected to solve problems, but I couldn't salvage my own. I began hating the world. I hated the fairies, I hated the pathetic people they helped, and I hated myself for being one of them. I stopped pretending I belonged among them. For the first time, I began to say and do what I wanted to do, rather than what I was expected to do. If the other fairies were going to condemn me regardless of what I did, I figured I might as well give them valid reasons to. When they replaced me on the Happily Ever After Assembly and gave my seat to Emeralda, I can't say I was surprised. I was furious and hurt, but I knew the fairies had secretly been waiting for an excuse to take something away from me. Emeralda had never been as gifted as me, but she had always been loved by everyone she met. The fairies knew appointing her would hurt me the most. I ran into the forest and found my trustworthy tree to cry into. I stayed and cried for days. I felt as if my soul had finally been crushed, and if my entire life had been a cruel experiment to see how much heartbreak I could withstand. When I finally dried my tears, I looked up at the tree. It was significantly taller than all the other trees in the forest. After all the tears I had shed over the years into its roots, the tree had surpassed all the others surrounding it. I was so ashamed of myself. I couldn't believe what I had let the world do to me. I cast a spell on the tree, causing it to curve and loop like a vine until it was the same height as all the other trees, and the evidence of my heartache was gone. That's the moment that the fragile, heartbroken fairy inside of me died, and the enchantress was born. I decided from then on, if the world was going to speak of my name, it would be whispered in fear, rather mocked with envy. If the world was going to take all the joy from me, I would simply take all the joy from the world. Esmea had almost forgotten she was alone. All the pain from her past was what had created the person she was today, so it was difficult for her to realign herself with the present. Everyone goes through heartache, Charlotte said. I've been through my own share of loss, but I got over it. I never plotted a ruthless revenge or held the world responsible. Esmea jerked her head toward her. Really? She said. Have you ever felt loneliness so strong that it hollowed your soul with every heartbeat? Have you ever hated the sun for rising and forcing another day of solitude upon you? I suppose not, Charlotte said. No one ever had trouble loving me. Rumpelstiltskin gasped at Charlotte's bold statement. Esmea was almost impressed by Charlotte's fearlessness. Careful, Esmea warned her. There's a thin line between bravery and stupidity. Charlotte turned away, unable to look at her anymore. Esmea placed the jar containing the king's soul back on the mantel. I should retire for the night, she said. I know I make it look effortless, but world domination is exhausting. I'm going to rest for a bit before continuing my attacks across the kingdoms. I want to be at my best when I cause the world's worst. Esmea headed toward her chambers for the night, but Rumpelstiltskin stopped her before she left the room. Esmea? Rumpelstiltskin asked, carefully filtering any judgment in his tone. Are you sure you'll ever find peace? Even after taking over the world, are you certain you'll be satisfied? Charlotte turned back, interested to hear the answer. A malevolent smile appeared on the enchantress's face. Silly Rumpy, Esmea said with a laugh. Who said I only wanted this world? Wah ha ha ha. Up next, chapter 14. Stay tuned.